So now basically we have deployed the HCI box. We can now have a look at what we can do with it and try out Azure Local. So again, we have this in the documentation page. If you go to using HCI box, this is basically the page which you will find, and this will go through all the different steps, how you can set this up a little bit more and use certain things as well, which we dive into a little bit as well. So if I scroll down here, again, we get some explanation that this is actually a 2-node cluster. And again, we know a little bit more what's going on here. But then there's things what we can set up. So for example, what we can do is we can set up monitoring to monitor our Azure local instance. So that's very powerful, usually to customers to like, hey, I can use Azure to monitor my local virtualization environment and host environment, to basically get all that insight and manage that. Imagine that especially interesting if you have a centralized IT team and then you have all these different locations where you run these clusters and you can manage those and monitor those centrally. So that's pretty cool. And again, there's a description how to set this up, also with the data collection rule and so on, and how to do this. It's fairly simple to actually go out and do this. And again, you will get some more information. What is actually running? Are the virtual machines running on top of it? Is everything working? Are the physical nodes here in a good shape? And so on. And you will also get more information on the health, like also performance-wise. You will get information on CPU load on the machines, disk load, networking, and so on, all the things you would expect. You can also go out and then actually check out like how to update resources, right? So if Azure Local really brings a very simple approach to go out and update the Azure Local environment. So in this case, think about it as a way to like update all the different types of the stacks, like the operating systems, the management software, as well as all the Kubernetes stack as well. And you can go out and update this, and we will have a look at that as well. You can then manage virtual machines, which we will have a look at. We can deploy AKS as well. And then there's some advanced configurations with many settings, as you can here see, which you can do as well to actually go through this. So again, there's also even a definition of what could be the possible next steps. So we could go into the Azure portal, try out Windows Admin Center, deploy GitOps for the Kubernetes cluster, so we can deploy the application on top of it, apply policies, and so on. All the cool things you can do now with Azure Local, but also with Azure Arc and AKS enabled by Azure Arc. You can try this out now. So let me quickly go to the cluster here. Again, this is one we have here. And again, as I mentioned in this view, you basically get all the information, what you would expect. You can see here a little bit more of what's going on in that machine. You can go to getting started and you can basically get some more things where, hey, I want to, for example, deploy a Kubernetes cluster on top of it. I want to use it for Azure Virtual Desktop. Or many other things. If you go to monitor, like you could also set up the monitoring piece. Again, if you want to, you can set up the recommended alert rules so you can get even notified. Obviously, as you're familiar with Azure Monitor, you can set this all up, but you also get some more information here on disk performance network, as I said, from the monitoring part, and there is obviously more. There's some additional capabilities which you can enable. Again, we talked about monitoring. You can also use Windows Admin Center directly from the Azure portal to do some more advanced configuration. You can set up disaster recovery, which helps customers to replicate virtual machines running on Azure Local, to actually replicate and protect them in Azure. So in case of a disaster or complete shutdown of the Azure Local cluster, or from like a data center outage or edge location outage, they can just fail over these virtual machines to Azure. And then there's some extended security practices here as well. So in addition, as it says, it's an Azure resource. Now, if, for example, you're working with this, you now have rights in this subscription, right? But you can, since this is following the Azure control plane, you can now also use access control to actually allow others of your team, for example, to have access and manage that cluster directly from the Azure portal as well, similar as you would do with any other Azure resource here. If we scroll down a little bit, one thing I want to show you quickly is the deployment review. So that is one thing. After deployment of this cluster, you will see here all the steps it went through to actually deploy this, and you can see here everything is green. You can do some additional configuration. So this is important if you're doing like cost stuff with the customer. Again, in the case of like testing this out, probably not necessary, but like some of the benefits here are actually pretty big. So if you can enable the Azure Hybrid benefit. So if a customer has Windows Data Center, Windows Server Data Center licenses with active software assurance, he can basically apply this and then get additional benefits without no costs, right? So for example, he would get Azure Local for free. So he can exchange these licenses, these Windows Server licenses with software assurance, to basically Azure Local licenses, as well as getting like Windows Server on top of this Azure Local for free as well. And then there are some other benefits, for example, such as like extend security updates. So if you have Windows Server 2012 in this today, or Windows Server 2012 R2, same for SQL, and they're out of support, you usually need to buy extended security updates. But we also offer you, if you move them to Azure, you can also get extended security updates for free. And since we treat Azure Local like Azure, because it is Azure, but it's running on premises, customers also can get these extended security updates for free if they run on Azure Local. There's also some things to show. So if we, for example, have any issues, we have some diagnostics and remote support tooling built in, so that when you have to collect logs from that system or something like that, or the customer has to do this, they can do that here as well. So what can the customer actually do? One of the things I want to show you here is the virtual machine management. So what we can do here is we can actually go out and now create a virtual machine from Azure directly on this Azure Local cluster. Imagine the customer using the Azure portal to create the virtual machine, which actually runs on-prem on Azure Local. And again, you can then basically choose this here as well. And since we are basically have this deployment location, right? So it's Jumpstart. We can then say, okay, this is going to be deployed. We can have some certain things we can configure, like CPU count, memory count, all that's things you actually need to do. I'm not going to run through this whole process, but you can basically create a virtual machine here directly from the Azure portal. And when I speak about Azure portal, obviously, this is just to show you, but this is baked into the Azure resource manager. So you can also use APIs, infrastructure as code to automate this as well, right? So similar as you would do for Azure VMs, you can do that for VMs running on Azure Local as well. And then the same thing we have here, for example, the possibility to not just create virtual machines, but also Kubernetes clusters. So I can create a new AKS cluster directly on the Azure Local instance. Again, similar as you would create an AKS cluster on premises, in Azure, you would do the same thing for that as well. So you can configure the node size, the node count, and all that, and then go through this and configure node pool, access, networking, all that stuff you need. Again, also for Kubernetes clusters. And then some of the big benefits next to, obviously, you can manage the local networks and things like that, which you need to actually connect the virtual machine to. One of the things I want to show you is VM images. So you can create your own VM images and basically store them on your Azure Local cluster or on a remote file share, or in a storage account running in Azure. So imagine if you have multiples of these Azure Local clusters, but you want to have one VM image centralized, you can put this on a storage account, and then basically all the Azure Local clusters, they will get that from that storage account. But you can also go and even get some images from the Azure Marketplace. So what you can do here is you can like basically syndicate these images and say, hey, we have certain images which are available in the Azure Marketplace, and you can see here those are Microsoft images with Windows Server 2025, for example, 2019. But then also, very interestingly, Windows 11 and 10 enterprise multi-session hosts. So those are needed, for example, to run Azure Virtual Desktop host pools, right, on premises. So if you have Azure Virtual Desktop, you usually run them in Azure, but with Azure Local, you can also have the machines running on premises, which is a great benefit. And so you can get these images directly from the Azure Marketplace as well and make them available. If we scroll down further, again, I talked about setting up disaster recovery as well. We also can look at like the different security settings. So automatically we can have different security settings. So we have, for example, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which takes care of what is run on the cluster itself, but also on the workloads running on this cluster, right? It's not just about the physical nodes and the cluster itself, but also if I deploy a Kubernetes cluster on top of it or virtual machines, I have that as well. And then HCI box or Azure Local is really designed to be secure by default. So there are some security settings you can go out and apply. Usually they're like on physical hardware, they're applied by default because they can. But since we are here in a nested environment, we don't necessarily have all these features available, but then there's a ton of things which we can do. There's also the app control bases where we make sure that there's not only apps we actually want to run on these physical nodes as well. And you can configure this like all across your environment as well, by the way. But with Azure Local, this really comes by default. And then if we go to monitoring here, again, quickly could dive into this as well. You will get some monitoring performance data related to Azure Local in this case. And you would get here, you would get like, hey, is everything good, right? Is there anything I need to take care of? You can see here the system health actually looks good. And then I could go through the different parts of the monitoring thing here as well. Now, one thing I want to highlight is the easy upgrade process, right? So if you now have a new version, which is here available, you can see here after current version is this, and then we can just hit the one-time update button, for example, and go out and deploy this update. I'm not going to do this right now, obviously, because it would, like, obviously I'm doing a demo here, but you could basically go out and simply just upgrade the whole cluster, which will also update all the management software, the operating systems and all that as well. And so this is a pretty good way of like showcasing Azure Local with Jumpstart HCI Box.